Whenever I agree to do one of these speeches, I always say to myself, I'm going to have my presentation done 2 weeks early and I'm going to get a haircut. So at least I'm consistent. So some of you may be curious about the title of this talk and what it is referring to. And as Paul just said, it's not going to be about a room full of elephants, though we may have some. And I'm also not going to talk about the elephants in the room that are our geopolitical situation. Before I go further, though, I would like to say that 7 years ago, I organized with two friends a conference in DC called Peak Oil and the Environment. Lester Brown, Bill McKibben, Ken DeFaze, I mean, a lot of the familiar names in this space. And I vowed never to do such an organization again because it was enormously difficult and a lot of work. So I just want to make sure we give a round of applause to Mikhail and Georg for what they've done here. It's been amazing facilities. And that's as politically correct as I'm going to get. It all goes downhill from there. So what I am going to talk about is what I think are the elephants in the room, which is going to give a little context of the last few days. Tomorrow marks my 20-year anniversary from getting an MBA at the University of Chicago. And I've worked on Wall Street for 10 years, and I've been researching energy, resources, trade, human behavior, finance, kind of independently for the last 10 years. And why does this matter? It matters because all the world's leaders are advised by economists or financial people very tightly. As Jim Buckey said, even the senior people at Exxon are advised by economists. And so I'm going to give a very quick overview of some fundamental flaws in economic theory, which is ubiquitous in the OECD right now, and wrap that into how energy plays a role and how ASPO plays a role. But the elephants in the room, there's so many elephants in the room that we don't even notice that the room is full of elephants. And I'm going to go through them one by one. So some of you may have seen this graph in some of my talks before. This is a three-tiered timeline of Earth's history. The top timeline is geologic time. And the small black dot line on the right is enlarged in the middle section, which is 20 million years ago, which is largely the timeline of primate and then human brain evolution. And the bottom timeline is the last 12,000 years. And you can see that a few hundred years ago, our population, which is the black line, exploded. And that was highly correlated to our economic output as well. So this is number 15 of my 15 elephants in economic and finance, is that we've designed our entire social system based on what happened in the small little section of A in the upper right. We've forgotten about biology and physics and just used correlation to make what appear to be laws which are not. Biological systems are polynomial in nature. They go up and down and are curvy. But our economic theories think that we're going to go a straight line up into the future. On the biology side, which I'm going to get to in a few minutes, I know for certain that everyone in this room is descended from a woman who invested at least a year in your upbringing and a father who invested at least 5 minutes. I know for sure that you all come from an unbroken line of ancestors who were successful in mating and also getting enough resources for the children to survive, and that goes back a long, long, long time. And whatever behaviors were pursued then were passed on in various long periods of stasis and then bottlenecks. That's how our brains were constructed today. This is not in any economic or financial textbook. The next fundamental error in economics and finance is that the environment is part of the economy. We know that not to be true. The economy is part of the environment. No matter what your view is on global climate change, if it's urgent or largely anthropogenic or not, we still have to acknowledge that we are really messing up the planet in a lot of other ways. There's huge species loss. Depending on the boundaries, we use between 30 and 50% of the net primary productivity hitting the Earth every year. So we are impacting the planet in large ways. The next fundamental flaw in economic theory is they don't give any special attribution to energy. Energy, if you account for imports and transfers, accounts for almost all economic growth. There's an incredible correlation, and that's a story well known to most of you. Economics treats energy as fully substitutable. The things on this graph all cost about $100. So from designer jeans, shoes, a sushi dinner, some tequila, all these things cost $100, but also a barrel of oil. And an economist would treat all these things the same. A barrel of oil has 5.7 million BTUs. If you translate that to electricity, it works out to 1,700 kilowatt hours. The average human would produce about 0.6 of a kilowatt hour per day. So on a normal working year, it would take 11 years to produce the same energy in a barrel of oil. The average salary in America is $45,000 per year. 11 years, that's $500,000 of labor is displaced by one barrel of oil. That is the story of industrialization. The swapping of manual labor for machine and fossil labor. That right there is the whole story. But there's more. Because of that, and Rainer Kummel talked about this yesterday, economists misunderstand the true drivers of GDP and economic progress. Energy is far larger of a driver than technology. Technology is an enabler for us to find more energy and to use energy in interesting ways. But given the statistics of how much power is in this stuff that we basically can't distinguish from magical pixie dust because it's so powerful, technology is very important, but it's secondary to energy. So economists don't give appropriate respect to energy, but I think energy people also don't quite understand the financial system. I'm not going to delve into what's actually happening right now, but I want to tell you how it got to be where it was. In the early, so this may come as a shock to many of you, but when you go to a bank and get a loan for $100,000 for some project, the loan and the deposit are created exactly at the same time. You get $100,000, and logic would tell you that somewhere else in the system $100,000 of purchasing power disappeared, but that's not the case. The loan and the deposit come at exactly the same time. The money is created from thin air. 95% of our money supply in all countries comes from commercial banks. That's been displaced the last few years with central banks. Now, think about the power of energy. 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, after the Federal Reserve was established, this was not a problem. We had so much bountiful opportunity in our countries with energy and technology and open spaces and new resources that money was actually in shortage. And we needed to get more money injected into the system in order to fulfill people's dreams and projects. That kind of changed in the 1970s, and to respond to the first oil crisis, and incredibly much after that, and unbelievably much in the last 3 or 4 years, we responded by creating more and more credit and money. So these are pictures of my backyard and my house and my dog and me and my father, and they represent another misunderstanding in finance. Financial people believe that the stock market, by some natural law, goes up 10% a year, and when it goes down a bunch of years in a row, that means the next 20 years are going to really go up. Well, all financial capital, stocks, bonds, commodities, cash, are markers for real capital. We use natural capital, which is our forests, our streams, our fossil fuels. We have built capital, this building, this computer, my house, my chainsaw, my solar panels, and we combine them with social capital, which is our networks, our relationships, our friends, our family, in this case my dog, and human capital is our health and our skills. So money doesn't really have any intrinsic value at all other than the social system that it's part of. And it's important to realize that, that energy and natural resources are our real capital. As you notice, I don't have any graphs in this presentation, but I had to kind of create one to illustrate this point. Again, these are my dogs. A few people have mentioned energy return on investment. In biology, it emanates from optimal foraging theory that you have to spend energy and other resources in order to get energy. This is the story of kind of our economy. The blue line is products, commodities like a refrigerator or a toaster, and over time technology gets better and better at producing those and offshoring them and getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. The red line, though, is non-renewable resources. Eventually we get to a point where we have to drill deeper in more environmentally sensitive areas. There are physical costs to pull the oil from several miles under the ocean floor that get larger over time. So this is how our economists think that oil will also be that blue line. It will get cheaper and cheaper over time, when in reality it's a different curve. It's the red curve. And that is because of the biophysical nature. Where I live in Minnesota, there's the iron ore range. It used to be 70% ore content in the hematite ore, now it's in the 30%. So they have to use more and more of the rock to get the same amount of ore out. So in nature, status is a huge driver. For three reasons. The peacock uses more energy, which requires more bugs and minerals and access to food, to grow such an ornate tail, which are negative fitness hits for that peacock. Number one, he's a lot more visible to a predator. Number two, it takes more resources to grow such a big tail. And number three, if a predator does see him, he's not going to be able to fly away as easily. All three of those are offset by the female's preference for a flashy tail. This is everywhere in nature, and we are part of nature. And status is an incredible driver in our own societies, and it can be done in less smaller footprint ways. But right now, money is highly correlated with status, and it's highly correlated with social power. And so I think few people in finance recognize that the reason that people want to make more in their portfolios isn't because of dollars, it's because dollars represent biological status cues. I would also say there's another theory called the handicap principle, by biologist Amos Zahavi, that suggests that waste is part of the natural world for part of these reasons. So not only is energy important, but the timing of energy flows is important. There's a concept called the maximum power principle, which states that biological organisms and ecosystems degrade an energy gradient as best as they possibly can at an intermediate rate of full power use and efficiency. And what this means is in nature, you have to time your energy use with how your metabolic functions need it. Humans are interesting in this regard, though, because because we have a cultural overlay. If we were just animals that went out and got our energy and then we had to eat it, and if our energy gain was going lower, we would have an immediate feedback. But we have a cultural overlay. So first of all, we can create money that functions as energy in the short term. But there's all sorts of other brain signals we get that give us the same feeling of a successful kill that our ancestors might have got. There have been brain functional MRI tests of stock traders that perform a winning stock trade, and the same areas in their brain light up as when an orangutan or a chimp finds a grape or something to eat out of a patch of objects. So the issue here is that we're pursuing the same evolutionary cocktails that our ancestors met with success. So it's one more game of free cell, one more orgasm, one more shopping center, one more $1 million, and the next day you wake up and you got to start over again. And I saw this as a high net worth broker on Wall Street. My clients were billionaires, and it wasn't about how much money they had, it was about the game, starting fresh every day, how to get to the next level. So how do we do this? Well, in finance, debt and how debt is treated in the financial textbooks is also incorrect. Debt is a spatial and temporal allocator of resources away from the periphery towards the center, away from the future towards the present. I could have had a fancy chart up here showing that, but we are in very literal ways stealing from our children in trying to keep up our maximum power at the moment and doing it in crafty ways that we believe have validity but end up having a steeper cost. I think it was a gentleman from the Gold Standard Institute yesterday mentioned about the productivity of each new dollar in the system. It's true that all major countries in the world have declining debt productivity. That means for every new dollar of debt or credit, we're producing less and less from it. And right now the United States is about at zero. For every new dollar of credit, we're basically staying flat. And at that moment, at a 1-for-1 rate, your new credit is really just an exchange of wealth for income. And it's patently unsustainable. Debt does not have to be a bad thing. If you enter in one new dollar of debt and you have some productive venture and it creates $1 or maybe even $2 of productive capacity, then debt doesn't have to be bad. But we've been going the opposite direction. It's not just the United States and Europe, it's every single country in the developed world and developing world is following that model. Some of you I looked up trust fund kids on the internet to get a picture, because that's what trust fund kids do, is they burn down their inheritance. That's, and second from the top left is David Cameron. So I've been talking largely about macroeconomics. Microeconomics also has flaws. There is a complete disregard for biology in our microeconomic foundations. There's something called the ultimatum game, which some of you may be aware of. Lots of alternative economists have been testing various cultures around the world. A very robust study where there's a game with two people. There's an offerer and a responder with some amount of money, say $100. And the offerer makes an offer. I'll take 80, you take 20. And all the responder has to do is accept or reject. If he accepts, both of them get the agreed upon amount. If he rejects, both of them get nothing. Standard economic theory would say if I offered 99 and Jim Bucky won, that he should accept, because that $1 that he took, he's better off. But many studies across many cultures show that people reject offers that are unfair. At 60, at 70, they reject offers. Some cultures even reject things under 50. This alone debunks our core concept of utility in microeconomics, because we as a species care about social interactions and fairness. This is not present. Jeremy Bentham and Adam Smith, the founders of economics, parsed human behavior down into these imaginary units called utils, or utility. And they could have equally parsed human nature into something of empathy or sharing. Neither one is the whole picture. But our society and our institutions are based on this rational man will make the right decisions in his self-interest and everything else happens. Well, what ends up happening is utility is another piece of pie for a 500-pound guy, and there's 2.5 billion people on the planet that have $1 a day. So this is an issue. I mean, basically, wants do not equal needs. And again, I'll say this, that in my time on Wall Street, if someone had $100 million and someone had $1 million, I'm certain that the $100 million person was not 100 times happier than the person with $1 million. In fact, he was probably less happy in my experience. So there is proof that with a slight increase from poverty upward, there's a large increase in satisfaction and well-being, and it tapers off. And once you have a certain level of wealth and income, you get very little additional, and in fact, it actually starts to decline. All right, moving on. Whoa, there's nothing on this slide. Well, this slide is actually a picture of the invisible hand. And the invisible hand works quite well in certain ways. The average supermarket in the United States has 80,000 items. And those items, actually, from the individuals and corporations and multinationals that make them, do get there probably in about the cheapest possible way, given what we currently have as constraints. But the invisible hand really becomes invisible when there is systemic risk. And because they're not responsible for systemic risks like peak oil and like this financial overshoot. I'll be careful what I say here, but I recently was working with a multinational, very large multinational company on mitigation for some of these risks. Over several days, I had beers with people and we connected as humans. And they were like, this is serious, this is real, I totally get it, this is important. And as humans, they agreed with me. But they said, our corporation cannot fund this because in this event, we wouldn't profit. This event would not be something that would be good for our corporation or any corporation. We cannot fund this research. So it struck me at that moment that the invisible hand is there until there's a crisis and then it's gone. The number one flaw in economic and finance, and this is certainly not any particular order, but when we were in MBA school, we were kind of taught that to go out and raise money for capital to give to a starving venture and to provide liquidity in the markets and trading foreign exchange and futures, that we were cleaner fish, that we went into the nooks and crannies and took out the garbage and the detritus. And that may have been true for a while, but as you can see by my slide, I believe that we've kind of morphed into barracudas, the financial sector. Thorstein Veblen was a 19th century economist. He was the guy that coined the phrase conspicuous consumption. But back then, 100 years ago, he wrote that in capitalism there's an important difference between industry and business. And industry was responsible for providing important essential goods to society, and business was trying to increase pecuniary values using pecuniary methods. And so I think one of the major things facing us is there's a disconnect between the industry and the financial games and turbo capitalism of where we've come to. So it happens that a lot of these elephants tend to overlap. I think if I could say that any one of these was the only problem, I think we could go to policymakers and they would solve them. But as many people have said, Eve and Jeremy, they're disheartened because the problem is so huge. And I agree with that. I think Rainer Kummel yesterday showed a glimpse that people at the IMF are starting to understand the importance of energy in all this, and that's definitely a start. So, to use Bob Hirsch's language from yesterday, I'm going to talk briefly about our situation. So, to power our economic system, we use an awful lot of ancient sunlight, which is the big box on the left. We also use old sunlight, which is timber and forest products that have been storing for 50, 60 years. And of course we use current sunlight, which is biofuels and the daily flows of wind and solar. But now we're using future sunlight in the form of credit. Credit, our economies right now would be in Great Depression levels after 2008 without government credit. And it would have happened before then without corporate and bank credit. I will make a provocative statement to this august crowd of oil experts that if for some reason debt was illegal, I can't imagine that would be the case, but in the 1970s, if you had to have cash to pay for everything and you couldn't have borrowed and borrowed at this accelerating rate, that oil would have peaked 20 or 25 years ago, and we would have had a much smaller decline rate. If you think about that, it's kind of a profound thought. And so what that implies is we've actually borrowed from future production, because if credit somehow unwinds and we do go down to $40 or $30 a barrel, think of how much production comes offline in that environment. So I would argue, and again, this is not probably a popular view in this room, but I do not believe we have an energy shortage. I don't even believe we have a liquid fuels shortage. We have energy and liquid fuels problem that will not allow us to continue to grow from these levels. There's not enough cheap oil to continue to grow our economies, and if oil gets cheaper, there's not enough to support meaningful growth. Therefore, I'd say that instead of an energy shortage, we have a longage of expectations, which is a subtle way to look at it, but I think it's correct. So where are we at in world economies? We are these mountain climbers going ahead. It's possible that we continue to have flattish growth for some time in the future if all these emergency government measures continue and people conserve and change behaviors. Human behavior and human decisions is probably the largest wild card. On the one hand, you've got factions that understand that debt is borrowing from the future and that we cannot continue that. That's the austerity crowd. And if really everyone goes for austerity, we're going to go off the left side of this cliff, which is deflation. Everything goes down because there's so many claims of what people think they own relative to what the underlying biophysical economy can produce that everything deflates. On the other hand, and this is where I expect, because of human behavior, we'll win out, is governments will continue to try and offset our problems with different financial shenanigans, and that may work for quite a while. But every time they do that, they take a bite out of the health of our currencies. And make no mistake, the boost in oil production in the United States and in some other areas in the last few years is specifically because of this central bank massive liquidity expansion. It's important to point out that money in that way cannot create energy, but money in that way can extract energy faster, and that's what's happening. Biologists and ecologists will know Liebig's law of the minimum, which states that even if you have a lot of one input to a process, your production is only going to be as good as your limiting input. So a plant, if it had plenty of water and plenty of nitrogen and plenty of sunlight, but no phosphorus, it would be limited. This applies to our situation in many different ways. Namely, if we divert all of our efforts to try and get more supply for fossil fuels, we run into, or more liquid fuels, we run into other constraints like water. Electric cars in the United States use between 4 and 18 times the water footprint, current technology, than gasoline cars. There's all sorts of things that if we say, let's go solar or let's go do this, that then we bring in all kinds of other unanticipated externalities. I'll briefly mention that Liebig's law also applies to trade. Trade is the real reason that all of us have as high of living standards as we have now, because we've gone to cheaper and cheaper ways of importing to the very cheapest country. And in doing that, countries can live way beyond their original endogenous limiting input because they're getting things from the guns and bananas idea. Comparative advantage really works. But again, there's a big risk with that, because if cheap energy or available credit, both drivers of trade the last 30 years, if either or both disappear, then the water recedes and you're back to some other limiting input on your own country. That's a risk. So my view is that we are very soon headed for a re-entry into a more biophysically linked economic system. And I think there's two things that need to happen. One is there need to be people working on what a sustainable human society with this amount of population or less or more might look like, using the science of what are our supply balance sheets, energy, natural resources, what do we have at what cost, what are our demand requirements. Biology determines what we need, culture determines how we get it. And so we have to marry the science of both supply and demand to figure out what such a system might look like. But once we get that, we bring it to Mr. Politician, oh yeah, okay, we'll do that. That's not going to happen. So we also need another team of people, or hundreds of thousands of people, working on a transition, how to get from here to there. And that transition may come because of human behavior, preferring the present over the future, not worrying about the future until the future arrives. Well, that's probably going to be how this happens. We're not going to take large steps to mitigate what's coming until we get the signal right in front of our face. So the more that we can prepare for those things ahead of time, as individuals and as societies, the better. I think we're going to continue to see environmental problems, and possibly increasing with Fukushima. I mean, who knows? This is a picture of a seabird off the coast of Peru, and they found all these plastics. It wasn't just one; there was a lot of them that they just eat in the ocean. Things like that don't seem to bother us too much, but if that evidence mounts, it's certainly starting to impinge on the psyche of people. But I think, I forgot who it was that said it yesterday, people are going to be, I think it was Bob Hirsch, people are going to be in pain. And when people are in pain, governments are going to try and relieve that pain, and this is going to be maybe a lesser pain. I hope not. As long as money is equated with status, teaching people to be sustainable is going to be like telling teenage girls to dress uglier. I do not think it's going to work unless we lead by example and pursue something that gives us status in different ways than money, because otherwise it just doesn't jive. There's a lot of good news in this story, of course. In America, and I'm not sure the statistics in the US, in Europe, in America we use 230,000 kilocalories a day per person. Our bodies only consume 3,000. So we have 80 times more energy use in chandeliers and airplane fares and all kinds of other footprints that we don't actually need to live. Now, if that was 8,000 versus 3,000, we would have a major problem. But there's a huge amount of leeway in our societies. An economist who's an ecological economist did a study and asked people from all walks of life, including financial people, would you rather have a 4,000 square foot house when all your neighbors had a 6,000 square foot house? Or would you rather a 3,000 square foot house, a smaller house, but all your neighbors had a 2,000 square foot house? The vast majority of people preferred the smaller house as long as it was bigger than their neighbors. And this is a core part. It's still, I forgot to mention that in finance, there's a great new study that shows that it's relative income that matters to people, not absolute income. There were 90 references in the paper, not one of them was biology. They don't understand that it's so simple of a behavioral response that we just want to be better than the people around us in that context is ubiquitous in nature. But I think this is a real opportunity for structuring things in a less resource intensive way. These are Philippine children. I did a study a few years ago that looked at energy per capita use versus percent very happy on the social value scale done by this massive sociological study. The US uses 38 times the energy per capita as the Philippines. They are slightly happier than us on average. So there's not a huge correlation there. That's another avenue for, at least for thought, if not for action. I also think empathy and mirror neurons and our ability to be social and lead by example and follow example is completely underutilized right now. We've kind of been squashed by this economic juggernaut, and it's suppressing some of the more benign aspects of human nature. And I also think as we re-enter a more biophysical economy, I grow a large garden, and I'm not doing it for food security, although that's why I started out doing it. I do it now because it takes my brain away from the internet and the email and the neural hijack that I would normally get and gives me back on a natural pace for a couple hours. I think that's very healthy. So that's another advantage. However, it doesn't have to be gardening, any physical activity. So there definitely are some negative visions of the future, and I think optimism is an evolved trait that we have. It suppresses, it boosts helper T cells and suppresses some negative stress hormones, etc. But I would say that I've come to view pessimism as a form of cowardice. I think pessimistic people try to lower the difference between their expectations and reality, and in doing so, it leaves them off the hook for action. So, of course, we all know there might be some Mad Max scenario in the future. I think it's low percent chance, 10%, something like that. I'm very pessimistic about our current economic system, but I'm quite optimistic about the social web of society and the environment going forward. So there's a difference. We can be pessimistic or have an outlook towards something, but still be looking for a better future. And since I'm going to run out of time, I'm going to skip my comments on gold, but basically I don't think we can run a future society on gold, as some may suggest. We actually are going to have to, as difficult as it may seem, we're going to have to embrace some of these elephants. I was working with the US government lately on some of these issues, and everything's got to be cleared through the economists. And the economists disagree with about 95% of what I just said. So once they start to crack a little bit, there might be some window. And I think the children are going to have to, the young people are going to have to just say, come on, what's this all about? Why are we doing this? And I think we have to engage our young people. Paul, I got about 5 more minutes. So where does this leave ASPO? First of all, I would congratulate everyone who's been involved with ASPO for all these years, because you were right, and you were on the right team. And those people, I mean, Colin Campbell, Jean Laherrère, 13 years ago with that article, and all the people that have been involved before oil peaked or plateaued, you were right. And a lot of people still don't understand the impact, but a near-term peak is a reality. So standing here at the 10th anniversary of ASPO, I wonder what would someone say standing at a 15-year or a 20-year anniversary of ASPO? What would we want to succeed at? My view is that the facts about peak oil are geologic in nature, but that the impacts now are perpetually going to be market and human behavior related. I think the signs are unequivocally there for all to see that resource scarcity is an issue. Everyone's right. I mean, we may have a unique stand on it, but the Wall Street firms are writing about it. Everyone's writing about it. It is a reality. This is not news anymore. I think one problem with the peak oil movement is that every problem we have is peak oil. That's because of peak oil. That's because of peak oil. And you won't like to hear this, but I will say it. In the United States, the words peak oil are like you just had some bad snail at a pate that had gone bad. You get a negative reaction when you bring those words up, similar to climate change, and I think there are some other words that are going to go that way. So I think oil depletion story is critical, and I think people are starting to warm up to understanding that, but the words peak oil, unless you're in this tribe, evoke a negative sentiment. I would say that no matter how our currency situation resolves, energy is going to be front and center in how we design future systems. And so everyone in this room is way ahead of the curve in understanding these issues, which is important. I think that the major message now is that we are headed, as Mr. Bucky said, and I kind of agreed with his charts, assuming there's no disruption, we're headed for a world with less. Doesn't mean we're headed for a world with nothing. Means that we have to change our institutions, change our expectations, and less doesn't have to be bad, although we certainly think it is now. So I believe that ASPO has two main choices. The grills on the top, the one on the left is $1,000, the one on the left is $200. There's something in economics called the anchor effect. And if you just have those two grills for sale, the vast majority of the people will buy the cheap one. But if you introduce a $10,000 grill on the bottom, significantly amount of people will buy the $1,000 grill just because of the anchor effect. I believe ASPO is the $5,000 grill, or the bottom one. Our views and our research allow other organizations that might not have quite as extreme views to get a little closer and to be believed. I also think the purpose of these conferences is to unite with our friends that we've been volunteering our time researching this important stuff for 365 days, and it gives us a shot in the arm and try to give us courage and passion to do it for another year, because the world hasn't really caught on yet. I think the other path, which I would prefer we take, is forget about the internal differences of what we might advocate, because I think the time for advocation is over. We have to shape the future now. And I think we have to get together with other organizations, the climate people, the sustainability people. There's tons of well-intentioned, smart people with resources working on shaping a better future. They don't understand energy. They don't understand the constraints of how energy has powered our economies and the importance of it going forward. We need to cross-pollinate with them on this situation, because too many people have their own petty projects, and there needs to be somehow a systemic alliance on these things. And we can be leaders by example on these issues, I believe. And there's sociological research that shows that all we need is 10 to 15% of a population to understand an issue, and the rest gets it very quickly. And I don't think this overshoot peak oil has quite gotten to the 10 to 15%, but it could. So I'm about done. I think there's a lot of people who recognize that there are storm clouds on the horizon. The guy I sat next to on the plane just spontaneously started saying, yeah, the whole thing's going to collapse. And I'm like, really? Why? And he was telling me about energy and water shortages and financial crisis. And I said, well, so what are you doing? He's like, oh, I'm moving from Holland to the United States. I'm going to run the North America operations for a coffee machine producer. They're going to start making coffee machines. I'm like, oh, that's cool. So I think there are so many people that either on a conscious level or a subconscious level recognize that we are on the threshold of change. They just don't know exactly what to do about it. And they're waiting at the starting line, and they just need to get some environmental signals from other people doing productive things in the right direction. I think a lot of people, based on the invitee list here from Austria and Germany, want to get Austria renewable, 100% renewables. I think Austria is probably one of the few countries that could do it, because you have so much, the gold standard of energy is, pumped hydro. I believe 100 years from now, the richest places in the world will be those that have pumped hydro. But in doing that, please try and remember the context of some of the other things I talked about, that this is now kind of an economic story. So in conclusion, I'll leave you with some, I've talked about some profoundly serious things, hopefully in an entertaining way. I don't have the answers to all these things, but I think there is a need to look at things holistically. So some key points that I would leave you with is that energy is what we have to spend, and money is just who controls the energy for now. Money cannot create energy, it can just extract it faster. We don't have an energy shortage, but we have a longage of expectations. And biology determines what we need, culture determines how much we have and how we get it. So this isn't the best picture. I got this morning in the email from my girlfriend's 13-year-old daughter. And I'll just speak to you as a human now, not as an ASPO person or as a speaker. But this is what I am going to go home to. I have a great house, and a small house, but I have a little family, and we have dogs and cats, and we have a relatively low footprint. And after having made a lot of money on Wall Street, I've spent almost all of it. I don't have guys making $500,000 trades sitting next to me anymore, so I don't feel the pressure to do that. I live much lower on the food chain, and I'm extremely happy. I recognize the risks going forward, and I think if more people recognize the risks and what was at stake, they would gladly sign up for this sort of future. And I think at some point people are going to be faced with those realizations that net worth is much more linked to self-worth than monetary digits. So in conclusion, everyone in this room, instead of being observers of history, are likely to be participants. And I think our decisions are going to matter, and I hope that you all remember that. There's no dress rehearsal. This is our life. Thanks.